in the university's constitution. It's not for us to presume to speak on behalf of the thousands of staff and students who will either support Remain or support Leave, or at this stage are undecided. Our job tonight, we believe, is to host an interesting, informed and balanced debate covering as many of the key issues as possible to help you make sense of the statistics, arguments, and dare I say it, the occasional posturing that we are facing at the moment. So before we start the substance of the debate, I'd like to introduce our panellists this evening. Immediately closest to me is Matt Rodda. Matt will be supporting the viewpoint that the UK should remain in the European Union. Matt is a councillor, Labour councillor for Kate's Grove Ward here in Reading, and a former Labour Party parliamentary candidate for Reading East. He believes, he says, in fairness for all, in high-quality public services and in an economy which works for everyone. Matt was a civil servant in the Department for Education and joined the Labour Party, he said, after being impressed with improvements made in education by the last Labour government. Matt has lived in Reading for 14 years. Beside Matt is Professor Beatrice Heuser. Beatrice will be supporting the viewpoint that the UK should remain in the EU. Director of MA programmes here in the School of Politics, Economics and International Relations. Beatrice's expertise lays in a number of areas in relation to the general subject of strategy, including European security, transatlantic relations, Britain, France, USA and Germany, plus strategy and defence policy making. Beatrice has worked as consultant to the UK Ministry of Defence, the French Ministry of Defence, the European Commission and the UK House of Commons. Beside Beatrice is David Wilkinson, and David will be supporting the viewpoint that the UK should exit the European Union. David was the founder editor of the Bruges Group's magazine, These Tides, and now works with the EU Democrats, the only organisation specifically setting up international Eurosceptic projects. As I said, David is from the Bruges Group, and a well-known independent think tank based in the United Kingdom, which was set up in the late 1980s. And the group in its research includes looking into alternative international relationships for the UK and a restructuring of Britain's relationships with other European countries. And right to the other end of the table, sitting beside David, is Jamie Martin, and Jamie will also be supporting the viewpoint that the UK should exit the EU. Jimmy is a former special advisor to Michael Gove at the Department for Education and worked as a management consultant previously in London and the Middle East across a range of industries. He now works in education technology, focused principally on the Africa continent. He writes regularly on science and technology and education, including for the Sunday Times, The Guardian, Standpoint and Times Higher Education. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our panel tonight. Ollie, to you.
Right, thank you, David. Can you all hear me? All right, so this is going to run a little bit like question time, as seen on TV. I'm going to try my best to be David Dimbleby in this debate. So we're going to start off by asking all of our panellists an initial question, which they'll all answer in turn. And then we're going to have questions from the floor. So please do think of some questions throughout the debate. It'd be really good if we could get a really interactive discussion going. So first of all, a few ground rules, because you always need rules in these things. So for questions from the audience, please raise your hand if you'd like to answer a question. We have some roaming mics over there. If the roaming mics can sort of let themselves know, there we go, and at the back there. So please, we'll get a roaming mic to you once we sort of have picked you. And then please keep your questions quite concise, because we'd like a wide range of opinions expressed today. So please don't sort of do a massive 10-minute long speech, because we'd like to get on with things. So please state your name when you're asking the question as well. It's pretty important, and then that's pretty much from the audience. For panellists, again, please keep things as concise as you can so we can get a wide range of views expressed. And respond to all questions in an appropriate manner, of course, and I'll do my best to have sort of balanced approach to everything as well. So that's pretty much it. Please use the hashtag EU Debate, UOR, on Twitter. So tweet some questions in and get it lively on social media if you can. And it will be available on YouTube tomorrow to view as well for your friends that couldn't make it today. So, without further ado, I'm going to ask the first question of the debate, and this is to all panellists, and we'll go down the line. So, first question. So after weeks and months of this political debate and the media coverage really covering it quite extensively, people might be getting quite bored of the EU referendum. So can you tell us why everyone should bother to vote at all? So I'm going to start with Matt.
Thank you, Ollie, for that. I'd like to start by thanking you and the Vice-Chancellor for organising the debate and for everybody for coming here tonight. And also, if I can, to completely and utterly break the rules of political answers by saying that the reason, very succinctly, why it's important that people get involved and vote is this is probably the single most important decision that Britain will make for the next 30 years. And it's a decision that affects all of us in this room, particularly people who are at university. You've got your whole working lives ahead of you. I'm here not as a complete Euro enthusiast. I appreciate that the EU is far from perfect, but I think that on balance, when you look at the evidence, which I think we'll do tonight, it's quite clear, in fact I think it's overwhelming, that it's in Britain's interest to stay in. And I'd just like to briefly explain why I believe that, and why I think the evidence stands up behind that very clearly. First of all, there's been a consensus for many years that it's in Britain's interest to be in the EU. That's across all the main political parties, across leading business figures, across academia, and in many other walks of life. So much so, in fact, that even Mrs. Thatcher was famously known for her views that it was better to be inside the EU, fighting Britain's corner, than it was to leave. And in fact, in her Bruges speech, which David's organisation refers to in its name, she famously said that it was better to stay in and fight Britain's corner and argue for our case and our interests in the EU. And I think that point of view, whilst it is a well-known point of view, whilst it might be seen as possibly by some as being a kind of establishment point of view, actually, it's common sense. And the evidence stands up behind it very, very clearly and very decisively, in my view. I'm going to talk about three areas really briefly for you. First is the economy, the second is trade, and the third one is international relations. And then I'll sort of draw to a close by just pointing out how some of these bigger picture things might affect our daily lives in Reading and at the university.
Sorry, mate, do you mind if we cover the areas a bit later? So we can
is that enough? Do you want me to?
No, that was a really good answer.
Okay, great. Well, I'll first that later.
Yeah, okay. Cheers,
Sorry,
so I'll move to Jamie, I think, next at the end to answer the initial question.
I think I just agree with so much of what Matt said about the importance of the vote. I think the average age of this audience is probably under 35, and a lot of you are under 25. One of the things that frustrates me about this campaign is when there's either side arguing about what the value of sterling will be a week after we leave. This is fundamentally about a future vision for this country and what this country is going to be like in 30 or 40 years' time. The reason we've got to leave is because that is the only way to create the kind of country that I want to see, which is us being the most open, innovative, pro-science and technology, pro-free trade country in the entire world. You can't do that within the EU. You can't go out there and have an immigration policy in the EU that says we don't care what country you're from, if you've got the skills you can come to Britain. You have to discriminate in favour of Europeans. You can't sign free trade agreements with China or India or the world's fastest growing economy, Ethiopia, or its most thriving African democracy, Botswana, because the EU doesn't want to do it. You also can't have regulations that promote science and innovation, because the EU gets lobbied by massive corporate interests to decline net neutrality, to have limiting limitations on clinical trials. And you've seen the criticisms from Google, from Spotify, and from Uber this week, all said that tech startups are going to leave Europe unless the EU changes its regulatory framework. You also, what you can't have is a thriving democratic political institutions. The EU is in its very nature. Matt just said all the establishments behind it. Well, I wonder why. It's because it's all about enshrining establishment power in the European Union, and it is very, very anti-democratic. What we need in the modern world are flexible, organic institutions that promote democracy, that take power away from politicians and give it more to ordinary people. The EU's 5 Presidents report, its blueprint for the future, is resolutely clear. More centralisation, more bureaucracy, more power in the hands of politicians. The future of this country, very, very clearly in a more competitive global world, is in being the most pro-science, pro-technology, pro-free trade, global country in the world. The last thing that is going to achieve that is tying ourselves to one continent, and particularly not if it is the slowest, most sclerotic continent. The future vision, 30 or 40 years' time, is us trading with the entire world, embracing the entire world, and doing so from a competitive advantage based on science and technology. To achieve that, we've got to lead, and that's why I think it is particularly in the interests of the younger people in this audience to vote to leave on June 23rd.
Okay, thank you, Jamie.
So much time again. I'm scared. I am seriously scared. If I were a person coming from a different planet to this world, and I knew my history of the world and history of Europe the way I do, I would say that the European continent is one that has been steeped in blood and warfare. And I am seriously of the opinion that the European Union was a Copernican revolution in European affairs that for centuries, indeed millennia, had been dominated by balance of power politics, which almost invariably at some stage led to a bloody war with thousands and millions of dead afterwards. It was a Copernican revolution because people suddenly got this brilliant idea that rather than trying to sort out their problems at each other's expense, they could join and create win-win situations. They could work on these problems together. That is what happened when the European Union was founded. Now, many people will say, yes, but there was particular circumstances, the Americans were backing it, they're still backing it, and then there was the Soviet threat, there was the threat of world communism, and that's gone, so why would we need that particular configuration still? I'll tell you, because I think it can fall apart. We heard in the earlier debate, Freddie was saying that there could be the knock-on effect of one country leaving the European Union that is at this stage brittle, that is at this stage diverging in its interests precisely because there isn't a really effective outside pressure in the same way on all of us. There is an axis going from Spain, Portugal to the Baltic states, to the southeast of which people are worried about immigration and refugees, and to the north of which people are more worried about Russia. There is a falling apart of interest there, and the danger that there is, as somebody who knows history, is that we are reverting to 19th century nation-state politics, and those invariably ended in war. Whatever this may cost, I'm listening to the old debates about the economy. From what I hear so far, nobody is predicting anything, or nobody has any firm evidence that it will go one way or the other. But I am prepared to pay very, very heavily, if I had to, in order to keep this extraordinary organisation that gives us peace and stability in Europe and gives us social security that was never there before in this way. And that is why I would cling to this particular arrangement.
Okay, thank you, Beatrice.
First, Lady Thatcher may have said that we should stay in the Bruges Group speech, but that really was at the beginning of her Eurosceptic journey. By the end of it, I think she was much more firmly opposed to Britain's membership, although maybe you wouldn't be so particularly interested following Lady Thatcher's lead. Okay, why should you vote in this referendum? The reason is that Europe needs to get rid of, it needs to overthrow this regime that is the European Union. It's not just this referendum, yes, it's British people who are voting this time in this referendum, but every time we have a referendum somewhere in Europe, it's not just for the country that's actually voting, it's deciding the destiny of all of Europe. And by voting in this referendum and voting for Britain to leave the European Union, it will, as Michael Gove said, set a process going in Europe. It will be good for Europe because Europe itself needs to get rid of the European Union. If you were one of the countries that joined 12 years ago, one of the Central European countries, it's been pretty bad. It's been, by what a lot of people say, really a betrayal. Those people, they didn't join the European Union just to become a pool of cheap labour. They joined in the expectation that their countries would be developed into a modern kind of competitiveness, even an equality. And that simply hasn't been experienced. If you compare how countries have performed in the European Union compared with the independence period, in the 20s and 30s, it's pretty dismal. If you're Greek, well, do I need to say very much about what's happening in Greece? It's not a good enough excuse for people to say the European Union, it's about working together. And it isn't enough to say that the European Union prevented a war between France and Germany in the 50s. It cannot keep on being used as an excuse when they're putting people all across southern Europe into misery. I mean, real misery if you live in one of those countries, and say, oh, suffer it, because otherwise we'd be having a war in Germany. That is simply not good enough. I'm sorry, we can't keep churning up that excuse. In any case, the regime that, if it did prevent war, and I'll say the Schuman principles are good, solid Christian principles about reconciliation. If it did do that job, then surely we should stick with the model that was able to preserve peace and not go along with the constant changes out of all recognition that have happened and will happen in the future. Because if you look at the reality now, it's more like a Cold War that's developing.
David, can I just mention it, because I'm conscious that you've all taken a wee bit longer than I expected for your opening statements, and perhaps I can encourage you to be a bit crisper in your answers, all of you, so that we get as many people from the floor. So I'm going to ask one more question before we move to the floor. There is speculation that later this week President Obama might make some comments about whether or not the UK will have less impact in the world outside the EU. If he does say that, is he right? Jamie?
No, he's not. I've got great respect for Barack Obama on a number of issues, but not on this one. I think everyone can decide for themselves. Will Britain have less impact in the world when we don't have a free trade agreement with China, India, Ethiopia, countries like that? Will we have less impact in the world when we have an immigration policy that shuts us off from continents that aren't Europe? Or will we have more impact in the world when we're outside of the European Union, but we're the most open global nation in the world? Our impact as 1/28 of the European Union is quite slim. I think our impact if we become the world's most global open nation would be very considerable. So on this issue, as much as I respect him, I think he's wrong.
Matt?
I beg to differ. I think he's absolutely right, and he's giving us candid advice as our best friend.
It's quite clear that we're one of the co-leaders of Europe. We also jointly lead NATO, and we jointly lead a number of other international organisations. Our interdependency and our work in those different fields overlaps and multiplies our strength and our influence. If you have the membership of the biggest market in the world, why would you want to give that up? It doesn't gain you any influence by going out, it actually loses it. It's very clear. And to come back to the economic points, if I may very briefly, because I was just going to elaborate on that a little bit. Jamie speaks eloquently about this future that he describes. We all want to see the country develop and grow. However, his argument lacks any basis in fact. When you look at the evidence from a range of independent sources, and please Google this, don't take it from me, whether it's the London School of Economics, whether it's former US Secretaries of Treasury, whether it's the leaders of major international companies, other business people, the large number of FTSE 100 chairmen and chief execs who signed up to support the in campaign, as opposed to the none who supported the out campaign, they all say that Britain would be better off staying in the EU. The UK Treasury figures estimate that it's about a 6% reduction in the size of our economy if we go out, and the reasons are very obvious. We lose access to the very markets that Jamie's talked about, because at the moment we've got a fantastic deal in getting into the Chinese market because we've negotiated it as part of a market of 500 million people. We wouldn't get such a good deal on our own. The Swiss haven't got such a good deal on their own. They've got much less access to China than we have. They're a very small country dealing with a very big one. It's a very simple equation.
Just clarify, the European Union doesn't have a free trade agreement with China. That's false. And this is the problem. How does it not have one? China, the world's biggest economy. India, its most thriving economy. It is a backwards-looking institution that links all the economic activities in Europe. That might have been true in the 1950s, but 2050 is about how do you embrace a growing China, a growing India, a coming Africa, and a coming Asia. And it is not by sticking in a backward-looking institution that still thinks we're trying to stop the Second World War from happening again.
David. Sticking to the question, David, is President Obama right if he's argued that Britain would have less influence outside the EU?
He's totally wrong, but I think you have to translate a little bit of what he's saying. if you ask the Americans, or even if you ask hard Eurosceptics in Central Europe, they are nervous about us leaving the European Union. But what is Barack Obama actually saying? I think the subtext here is that what the Americans fear is that the European Union without Britain becomes a slightly more dangerous place. The anti-Russianism of recent years is very recent. Before that, the European Union justified itself as being a rival to America, something that was anti-American. Without Britain, the European Union could, and I think in American fears, become something approaching a monster. That is, I think that's an extreme fear, but nevertheless I think that's what the Americans are worried about. It means that they accept that the European Union is a fundamentally bad thing, and it's only our presence that keeps it into being a less bad thing. We cannot carry on with those kind of abusive relationships. You've got to have real change.
Thank you very much. Beatrice.
Clearly the Americans need the UK in Europe because the United Kingdom has been the linchpin keeping NATO together for decades. And that is only based on, that's only possible because of Britain's particular commitment to Europe, which is directly connected with its dual membership of the two organisations. Britain is actually the one that has a proper nuclear guarantee for Europe. It is not the United States. Curiously, this is something that I imagine I see very few politics students here. This is something that is very, very little known. There is actually no nuclear guarantee in NATO. Do people know that? There is only a nuclear guarantee in the European Union Treaty. Take away British membership from the European Union, and the only country that will have and give a nuclear guarantee to Europe is France, that has, wrongly so I think, but has traditionally been very hesitant to recognise this particular clause as an obligation. Now, if you feel threatened by a country not very far from you, and you have the capacity to develop nuclear weapons, a number of times, a number of European countries have tried to develop nuclear weapons. Would you like that? Would you like that proliferation? So far, there has not been that proliferation because of the commitment of America and the United Kingdom. And the American situation with regard to Europe has changed very, very considerably since the end of the Cold War. So Britain is actually an absolute key player. I can elaborate on that, but perhaps afterwards.
Can I just interrupt for a minute? I mean, the question here is, would Britain have less impact in the world? So leaving aside the particular defence consequences that you've described, how does that relate to Britain's impact being less or greater in or out?
Britain's place about punches above its weight, particularly in defence. I mean, Britain's impact is not just trade and language and universities and things like that. The other role that Britain has is a world policeman. Britain is actually very key. It's a key role of the world policeman. It spends more than other people on defence. It has its troops much more importantly engaged, and that is actually one of its key roles.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, now let's go to a question from the floor. Any volunteers? Yes, gentleman in the second.
This is a question more particularly for the supporters of the out vote, and it's this: given your emphasis on the sclerotic character and the inward-looking nature of the EU and its failure to trade with growing global economies, how do you account for the fact that Germany, who lacks the maritime and global traditions, or at least is not as well advantaged in that respect as we are, has surpassed us in exports to all the BRICS countries, to Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and indeed other economies such as Canada, leaving us far behind, and indeed some other European countries surpass us. According to one set of statistics, even Belgium surpasses us in exports to India.
Okay, thank you for the question.
If you want to know why Britain doesn't export more outside of the European Union, it's because we're in the European Union. If we were able to sign a free trade agreement with China or India, we could export more to them. Now, the European Union does work quite well for Germany. I think that's completely reasonable. But we're not having a debate about whether Germany should stay in the European Union. It's a manufacturing economy which benefits greatly from having a free flow of European labour and a devaluing currency through the euro because it's so weak. We're a service-based technology economy. And James Dyson spoke very fluently on the fact that German manufacturers tend to sort of control EU regulation which hurts British companies. What we need is a pro-technology, pro-science union, and that is what we don't have. And I'm afraid Germany's economy, which is really quite a sort of 20th century one based on manufacturing, is very different to ours, which is an open science technology-based one. We cannot have a European Union where the greatest threat to British science and technology is them making huge regulatory mistakes, like the ones Google were warning about just this week, and then taking a decade to correct it. It might be okay for Germany, it does not work for us. And the way we become...
Thank you very much. Matt, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, thank you. I'd just like to come back on that, both on the general point about comparing economic growth and then also the specific, rather misleading one and cheeky one about the technology sector. Interesting that Jamie picks this up in the very week when a leading group of technology entrepreneurs have all written to the FT to say we should stay in the EU for obvious reasons, along with the many British scientists and the overwhelming weight of scientific opinion, including well-known scientists like Stephen Hawking, Robert Winston, who are in favour of staying in the EU. The clear case for the EU is that it's not only a big market, but it gives us access to all these emerging markets. If we left, we'd be in the position, the very unenviable position of then having to renegotiate trade deals with China, with South Korea, etc. There are 53 countries around the world. Well, how else would we do it? We have to do that. Look at the British, if you look at the Treasury's own report into this, it's quite clearly spelled out, and a number of other reports have made the same points. We'd have to renegotiate deals with these other countries, which would take time, and that is a fundamental problem. The reason why the various different studies suggest that Britain's economy would decline if we left the EU is partly because of the huge uncertainty and the time it would take to negotiate new trade agreements. The other point which Jamie unfortunately doesn't mention is that the AMP campaign themselves are quite divided in what a post-Brexit Britain would look like. Would it look like Norway, where it would have to adhere to all the EU rules and the freedom of movement, and pay money to the EU, because it's part of the single market, and yet have no say of those rules? Would it perhaps look like Canada, which only has partial access to the EU market, and in particular doesn't have access for all its service industries, which, as we said earlier, are crucial for Britain's economy? Or would it look like someone like Brazil or Russia, with even less access to the EU market? They haven't made clear which of those three they would like, and possibly that's because they don't know themselves.
Just very briefly, it is super clear.
Jamie, we're going to take another question from the floor, because we've got quite a lot to get through.
Could I come back?
No, we'll come back to
this question. We did direct it to people who were for leave, so...
I'm going to take another question from the floor, because we've got quite a lot to get through. You can probably get it out a bit later. Another question from the floor, please. Yes, there on my left.
Yeah, just a question. Assuming that the UK does leave the EU, do you not think that this would put a high risk the security and stability of the economic and social side of on the social aspect of the UK? I'm not sure you're
David first, yeah.
I don't think that's a very reasonable fear, and there's two main things to say about it. First of all, is this idea that you could have sort of socialism by the back door was first presented at the Trade Union Congress, or most famously presented by Jacques Delors 20 odd years ago, when he put it to them quite plainly. You cannot get what you want through democracy, so come to us in Brussels and you'll get it with us. It's a similar thing we heard from a big organisation of benefit sponges, I heard, NFU, that's right, saying the same thing. They could get money through the Brussels system, but they might not get it if the British government itself, a democratically elected government, could choose how that money was spent. So they said, we support the European Union because it's financially in our interests, and they would go against democracy for that. And yet we'll tolerate that kind of thinking in a modern democracy. And it's a similar approach, and it doesn't work. If you cannot get these things through democracy, then really you should pack up your way of thinking. And the other thing to say about it is the idea that the European Union is run by people who have the best interest, they try to protect, for instance, agency workers. The result of that is you get zero hours contracts, and it drives down the conditions of ordinary people further and further. There's people from Central Europe just being shipped around like so many serfs. Family breakdowns in...
We'll stick to answering the question from the
okay.
So if we can move to Beatrice.
I've been very, very worried about social security if Britain leaves the European Union, because I think one of the driving factors for the outvote is to say, yeah, labour costs are too high and the social security part is too high, we have to reduce that somewhat. I think this is one of the most amazing acquis, other than security in the military sense, is security of the European Union, that we have this idea that there's nobody starving on this continent. This is extraordinary. Again, this is something that's never been had before in history. A continent where people don't starve. This is why everybody's trying to get here. And very clearly, this is something that is costing us an awful lot, and it's something that's making us, in some respects, less competitive, absolutely, and this is a great problem to sort it out. Yes. On the other hand, we all know, you, the people in this room, can sort of be confident that if you stay here, you will be looked after. If you break a leg, you can't work any longer. And from that point of view, I would very, very strongly be inclined to say, for goodness sake, stay in and have that security.
To keep us moving along, I'm not necessarily going to ask every panel member to respond to every question, but we will try to ensure that we get balance both in the argument and across the four panel members. I just want to move us on a bit to ask a question about the impact of a leave vote on Scotland, and whether you think there is a potential threat to the UK if Scotland votes one way and the rest of the UK votes another way. So David, I'll let you start this time.
Okay, I think with Scotland, it's a bit of a myth put out by the SNP that Scotland dearly loves the European Union. If you look at opinion polls, the figures are not that different. In any case, it is a rather peculiar form of nationalism that does not want to govern its own country. If we left the European Union, many of the powers that we would bring back, fisheries for example, would be devolved straight back to Scotland. So they'd have more powers, they'd have more Scottish nationalism. So I think they're being a bit silly in those claims and inaccurate. I don't think the people in Scotland are any less Eurosceptic than anyone else anywhere in Europe.
Perhaps I'm allowed to ask the question this way to you, Matt. Does Scotland matter?
Yes, yes it does. It really does matter. Sorry, David, to go on, but I think you really addressed an important constitutional issue for the rest of the UK, because it is quite possible that the Scottish could vote slightly differently to the other home countries. Now, in that situation, I think you played it down, David, actually, but wrongly. That creates all sorts of tensions. There are people within the SNP, not necessarily Nicola Sturgeon, who's actually quite a cautious politician, although she's quite forceful when she's interviewed. There are people within the SNP who would dearly love to have a second referendum, and they're very, very keen to fight it. They're trying to shift the political culture of Scotland towards nationalism all the time. They could do well in the elections this year. I think it would be a clear and present threat to the future of the UK through exactly that route. The nationalists would have exactly what they wanted given to them, ironically, by the Brexit campaign.
Okay, let's open it up to the floor again. I've got a few hands signalling. Gentlemen at the back, perhaps we can get the mic. Can you keep your hand up, sir, please, so we know who you are? Thank you.
My name is Lars Dixon, and my question is, would leaving the EU strengthen or worsen our relationship with America, considering we have a special relationship?
No. It's the Americans who keep telling us to stay in. Britain's value to the United States has been, as I said before, the linchpin between Europe and the United States. It's a concept that goes back to Churchill, where he basically said Britain should be at the heart of three concentric circles, or rather three overlapping circles. That would be the middle of the three circles where they overlap, between the special relationship with the US, the relationship with Europe, and the relationship with the rest of the world, where many areas were still before at that stage in the Commonwealth. Crucially, if you already have Obama saying that Britain should stay, and that would be important. If you have the General Ben Hodges, who's the SINC of the American Land Forces, saying, for goodness sake, please, Britain should stay in the European Union, it was so very important for the special relationship. If you have 8 former finance ministers of the US saying Britain should stay in the European Union, it would be in its interest and also American interest. That's a lot of people saying, important people saying that.
Jamie, any threat to the UK-US special relationship?
David is actually burning to jump in. Are you?
Yes,
so I'll take the next one.
Well, I think the first thing is, what is so special about this special relationship? In recent years, the Americans have got us into a fair bit of trouble. It isn't such, and never has been such an advantageous relationship for us anyway, not since the times before the First World War, when we nearly had a war with America. It can be overstated. We cannot, in this country, or in any other country, say we will do what the Americans want. No, we have to look at what is best for us and best for our neighbours. And there's another big concern about the way that the European Union is going today. It's not so much a fear of us falling out with the United States, it's the mischievous way that they are provoking Russia, designing a new Cold War, I think, apart from anything else, because they think that this external hostility will force some kind of internal unity. They're the kinds of things that we really must be cautious about being dragged into.
Thank you, David. One more from me to the panelists. Right, so will we be able to control immigration better if we are in or out of Europe? And what would happen to UK citizens working in Europe and EU citizens working in the UK under Brexit? I'm going to start with Jamie.
Yeah, super keen to jump in. I mean, the obvious answer is yes. But UK citizens working in Europe, I mean, anyone who's currently working here from Europe or anyone who's currently working in the EU from the UK, there will be no change. I mean, nothing on this will change for 4 or 5 years. What will our immigration policy be when we leave? The crucial element of the European Union's immigration policy is a belief in European nationality trumping anything else. So, as a European national, you have completely free movement, and then visas are placed on people from other countries. I'm afraid I think that's very stuck in the past. I think it's morally wrong, and I think it's economically flawed. We are now in an immigration system where someone who left school at 15 in Germany has got more rights than someone with a PhD from the best university in China. That might have made sense in the 1950s when the European Union was founded. It will not make any sense in 2050. If we leave the EU, we'll have a points-based immigration system which will apply to everyone, whatever country you're born in, equally. We will have more skilled immigration from outside of the EU, so entrepreneurs, scientists, more of them will come from outside the EU, and we will have less unskilled immigration from within the EU. So take the example of the NHS. It's a massive win for the NHS. The people who come in who are unskilled migrants tend to be service users, but the NHS cannot get the doctors and cannot get the nurses it needs from outside of the European Union. It's a mad policy. We'll change it. We'll have more skilled immigration from outside the EU. We've got great doctors and nurses coming into this country from other countries. We'll have less unskilled migration. You cannot control immigration, have a sensible, skills-based immigration policy, stay in the European Union. You can have one which globally embraces the world and gets the best talent from around the world if you vote to leave.
Okay, thank you, Jamie.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to debunk a couple of myths, actually. I think one of the most important ones is that free movement is a bad thing. It's actually a very good thing. It enables all of us to live and work in the rest of the EU. That's hugely positive. If you look at this university, it's incredibly well integrated with other countries. And by the way, being involved in the EU doesn't stop people coming from Commonwealth or other backgrounds around the world, far from it. In fact, it makes Britain a more appealing and attractive place for those highly skilled migrants to come. And what's more, there's been a highly skilled migrant programme for a number of years. We have a steady stream of people with many skills coming in from around the world. Many of them are in academia and in Reading University, in fact, at the local level. So I think Jamie's presenting a rather misleading picture there. I also think that on the broader point of migration across Europe, it's worth bearing in mind that not only does Britain have some scope to manage the migration from across Europe, but that there are real and very significant benefits to all of us in this room as British citizens for being able to live abroad. And furthermore, there are questions about what would happen to the 3 million plus Brits living in France, Germany, Spain, even 300,000 in Ireland, Bulgaria. What would happen to them in Brexit? Now actually, one of the reasons that I made the economic points earlier. I think the key thing to bear in mind about Brexit is it's incredibly risky and really quite scary for our future. And for those 3 million people, it would be deeply, deeply difficult. What would they suddenly do? Would they have to come back from Spain in a rush in a few years? We just don't know. That this has never been tried before, and it's another example of the rather wishful thinking kind of approach that's peddled by the Brexiters without making it the reality of the situation.
It's not wishful thinking. It's like accuse you of daft scaremongering. I lived most of my time in Estonia. I've got a little farm there, and I was worried about this. So I wrote to the foreign minister, and I asked her if Britain leaves the European Union, because she knows I'm a Eurosceptic. I said, will I be subject to any reprisals or retaliations? Will I be punished? And this I did write, so I'd have a proper reply back. And she said, no, of course not, it's silly. And she knows I bought my house before Estonia joined the European Union. They said, will they start to hate me? No, it's daft. It's a silly scare thing.
Let me comment on to debunk none of this. Can we just stick to really, really hard information? I mean, what is special about the special relationship is in very, very concrete terms intelligence sharing. It is in very, very concrete terms nuclear technology and the sharing of satellite information for nuclear targeting, things like that. It is in very concrete terms the joint nuclear planning. So very, very clearly, there's a very hard core in that, and that has coexisted very fruitfully with the membership of Britain in the European Union. It wouldn't change, the cooperation with the United States in that respect wouldn't change, but in fact the United Kingdom, and this is from the former head of GCHQ. One of the reasons why in intelligence sharing the United Kingdom is very valuable to the United States is also that it is a channel of information and intelligence coming from Europe to the United States. Not in the way that is simply passed on and everything is shared in every possible way, but it is an absolutely crucial element there in this particular special relationship. And it's not a question of, oh, is it good for us in the First World War, is it bad for us in the First World War? There are simply very hard elements of this that are really deeply ingrained in the way in which the governments interact, and that is not something that you can, it's not up for grabs. It's
I'm just going to go to the floor. I think more in relation to what's been discussed or any new questions. So I'd like to go right to the back, please, right by you, Sam. Just in front of you.
Something that you all mentioned several times in your introductions was that of the toppling effect. If Britain leave the EU, then other countries will follow. But doesn't this actually show us how corrupt and broken the EU is, rather than giving us a reason to stay if so many other countries could supposedly be on the cusp of leaving too?
If it was just repeating the question, yes, you did. Yeah, I think, if I'm right, the question was if Britain leaves and there's a kind of domino effect and others leave, does this not raise some questions, I think to use your words, about the corrupt effect?
Yeah, the corruptness of the EU and so many other countries.
It was a beautifully put question.
Okay, Beatrice, let's go first.
Very briefly, it's about like saying we have a state, there are pockets of criminality within it. Wouldn't it be better then to take the state away because the state is not functioning perfectly? Basically, yes, all human groups have a tendency towards collective egotism, etc. At the moment, the tendencies are growing in all sorts of, in the number of European states, in fact throughout European states. Now, is that a sign that the organisation that is actually helping them mediate their problems or manage their problems together, is the organisation therefore at fault, or is it the fact that there is a rising insecurity within those states with all sorts of other factors coming together, such as the economic crisis since 2008, immigration, the problems of integrating minorities in all these societies, something that should be tackled together? Or is it, should you take that big framework away so that they can really get to each other and really have another war? And come on, seriously, that is not a joke.
It is a joke. It is a joke, because let's take the question about the unpopularity and the corruption of the European Union. And the first thing is the European Union is massively unpopular across all of Europe. So if we left, the intimidation and reprisals that you're hinting at simply couldn't happen because there'd be no support for them. Not even amongst big business. German car companies wouldn't tolerate this kind of nonsense. The idea that, let's talk about an example of the corruption. Did the big system euro cure Greek corruption? Or did it depend on Greek corruption in order to bring the Greeks into the euro? You can't. you cannot say that the solution to European Union corruption is more Europe and it's somehow the nation state's fault. And if you don't have the European Union governing these people, they'll start wars with each other. I mean, take the corruption in Greece a bit further. Greek people now, that the European Union is generally in Greece, as far as I'm aware, amongst my friends at least, referred to as the Fourth Reich. The Germans are massively unpopular in Greece. These tensions in Europe are being forced, they're being generated by the European Union, and the impression is it's forcing on people. It's giving people a reason to hate each other.
Yes, I'd like to come in. Thank you, David, for that very free-flowing explanation of your views. I think if we just move back away from some of the more extreme statements that have just been made and actually come back to the core of this whole argument, Beatrice and I are not saying the EU is perfect. There's no international organisation, no government is perfect. What we're saying is it's a hell of a lot better than the alternative. And as you've heard from the speakers, although they've danced around the subject, Brexit is not really a very attractive option for Britain. It means losing ties, key economic ties, it means a reduction in economic growth, it means a reduction in our security, it damages our relationships with other key players around the world, which we've got a very, very close and, of course, with the Americans, a special relationship with. It's not a very good idea. And for us to be told that we're scaremongering by pointing out the obvious in a very clear and factual way, I think is really beggars belief, to be honest with you.
It's just remarkable to me that we're hearing the same thing from Matt we hear from David Cameron. His argument in this referendum seems to be, he spent his career telling us basically how rubbish the EU is. David Cameron's argument now seems to be, the EU's rubbish, but we're so weak and even worse that we couldn't do any better. Matt just himself just said, it's not very good, but the alternatives are worse. Let's leave and let's build something better. If you look around this country, it's a country with world-class universities, a brilliant multicultural population, a thriving economy. Of course we could do better outside.
On our own?
Of course, no, not on our own. This is the whole point. The world isn't only Europe. You should travel outside it a bit more. Do what I do. I'm serious. So last week I was in Nairobi. There is more tech innovation going on in Gove Road, Bishop Magua Centre in Nairobi, than probably the rest of this continent outside of Britain. The rest of the world is pulling ahead with really exciting tech, science-backed economic growth. Now we have a choice. Do we tie ourselves to a slow-moving continent? Even the Remain campaign of it is a failure. Or do we say, do you know what, there are really exciting things going on in Latin America, Asia and Africa. Let's become the most global open country in the world. Let's sign free trade agreements with a country like Ghana, which has 8% growth year on year, which the EU would dream of. And let's get out, let's build something much better, international cooperation based on a forward-looking, optimistic vision that says the world can do so much better than a top-down, centralised, politicians know best, controlled EU. We're going to build something which is organic, which is genuinely going to...
Let's move on, let's go back to this. Gentleman with black t-shirt on, do you want to take the microphone? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I'm quite, we have a lot of things going on today here, and it's a bit disappointing. But I'm going to move on and ask a question which everyone is asking. What is your exit strategy? What are we going to do? I've had a lot of talk about EFTA, WTO, and there are all these things flying out there. But what are we going to do when we leave the EU? And is there any unified strategy from your side, from the Brexit side, that when we want to leave, this is what we're going to do?
I think it's probably fair to ask the Leave campaigners that first, but I will obviously put the question to the Remain campaigners as well. The question is, Jamie, what's the exit strategy to use gentleman's phrase?
So I'll direct you immediately to a politician who, despite his terrible former special advisors, gave a brilliant speech the other day. Michael Gove's speech maps out very, very clearly what Leave looks like, right? What Leave looks like is Britain with a free trade agreement with Europe, very closely integrated with the EU in terms of cooperation, but we're free to sign trade agreements outside. What it looks like in immigration is a points-based system where European nationals, just like anyone from around the world who've got the right skills, can come to this country, but there's not uncontrolled immigration from outside the EU. And it means we are not in the single market, where I think harmonisation of regulations with a country like Greece is not in the interest of Britain's economy. But we are obviously having a trade agreement with Britain where we have the right rules and regulations. What it looks like, more importantly, is it looks like every other open democratic country in the world that governs itself. How does Canada run? What about Australia? What about Botswana, one of those world's most thriving democracies? You don't have to be in some kind of supranational, top-down institution to function in the modern world. That was probably true in the 1950s, when the EU kind of made sense because there was the Cold War, it was big bloc against big bloc. The way the modern world is actually going is independent countries who are very globally interconnected will be one of the many thriving, open, democratic states. Australia and Canada are great examples of this, who have as much proximity and trade agreement with countries like China as they do with Europe.
David, anything to add on that question about economic strategy?
Two very brief comments. I won't give you a blueprint, but I will criticise what these people say about the nature of freedom and hope. They say, oh, what will it exactly look like? If you can't tell me exactly what the details of the future, they're terrified. It is in the nature of freedom that you have lots and lots of different options. It won't be specifically the Norwegian option or the Canadian option, it will be the British option.
Absolutely.
And I say that kind of fearful attitude, when this gentleman here asked why the Germans do so much better in the outside world than it appears that Britain does, it's because, I dare say, the Germans are not as afflicted by the kind of fearful, terrified attitude that we hear from the Remain campaign.
Okay, the Remain campaign presumably doesn't have to answer what the exit strategy is, but they may wish to comment. So, Beatrice, on the question.
Let me just comment on one thing. Surely you have caught up with the fact that the state is losing power, and that since Susan Strange has been working on this in the 1990s, the state is completely unable to control these huge multinationals. Only a group of states can possibly influence what's going on there.
So why
the one state is going to stand up against it.
It's literally bizarre. Why
they're the ones who can enforce labour rules. Just to think of what it would be like if you're confronted with
Australia do it.
And you just let's get back to the 19th century. Let's get back to the 19th century. The workers had no rights and wars were just around the corner.
Okay. So we're now in the 19th century.
That's it. Return to the nation state. Great.
Thank you. Do you know what? I really quite like Michael Gove. I think he's great at provoking controversy. And it's fascinating. On the one hand, you've got all these highly experienced former secretaries of Treasury in the States, the boss of Ford, the Bank of England, etc., etc. The list goes on. The IMF is endless. The list of C100 companies, the leading people in Britain. And on the other hand, you've got Michael Gove. And of course, Michael Gove writes a beautiful essay and makes a lovely speech. That doesn't change anything. The reality is we'd be in a mess if we left the EU. And the other reality is that the EU multiplies our power. Are there other international organisations you'd like us to leave? Why don't we just leave NATO or the UN while we're at it? It's crazy. You're proposing a pointless, self-defeating, really tired and quite, I would say, narrow view of Britain.
This is a 19th century view as well.
Please don't interrupt me. Thank you, Matt. It's getting quite intense. So, can we get another question for, yes, the gentleman in white, so there, please.
Thanks. So Matt, first, I just did a little Google and I also listened to Dan Hammond's thing on Question Time from last week. Tate & Lyle, JCB and Simpsons all said that they'd probably be better off leaving the EU. So it's not just people saying they want to stay, corporations saying they want to stay in the EU, there's some saying they want to leave as well. And obviously, with the Leave campaign, they're probably not as desperate to try and get a list together so they can make a big publicity thing about it. Okay. Secondly, to Beatrice, there are thousands of people starving in the EU, and there's a couple in this country. I'm surprised Matt didn't interrupt you there because he's so against Conservative policy being someone from the Labour side. Sorry, okay. Also, the thousands of people starving on the border of Europe. We can't solve that problem ourselves. Are you being a bit too narrow-minded, looking just at the European Union as opposed to the entire world?
So,
first of all, in a way it's good that Tate & Lyle and these other two companies have decided to support out, because actually it shows the difference. Many, many companies on one side, 3 on the other. But I'll discuss that with you later.
Now, leave me alone. Counting's not less one point.
Clearly. Yeah. Okay, we'll we'll come back to that later, but the overwhelming majority of informed opinion is in favour of staying in, which it has been in Britain for many years, and that includes people like Mrs Thatcher and many other Conservative leaders and many other people from other political parties, not just the Labour Party. On the point about, sorry, what was your other point? I got the point about Tate and Lyle.
In the EU starving, I'd say on the borders, and that's the whole point. They're trying to get in, and they're drowning trying to get in. 500 last
They're
year.
inside the EU, and they are starving because no one wants to take care of them.
Okay,
no one wants to take care of
thank
them.
you.
Germany doesn't want to take any more because they want to take too many. So why don't you get Saudi
I would like to
Arabia
go back to the panel, please. Yeah, thank you. Jamie?
Yeah, very keen to go. I think, we just had the majority of informed opinion is for the EU. This is the problem with the whole Remain campaign. It is an establishment, we know best, listen to the politicians, ignore the grassroots. Yeah, you've got a few FTSE 100 chairmen. Goldman Sachs are very on your side. They gave you £700,000 because they control European banking regulations. They can crash the economy and earn fees for getting Greece into the euro. The point about this is every time the Remain campaign says, we've got a list of 150 middle-aged bureaucrats who think should stay in the EU. I'll tell you what it reminds me of. It reminds me of those debates when Trump keeps telling everyone how big his hands are. That's what it reminds me of. It's pathetic. This is about a democratic election where we want to know what ordinary people think. I don't care what bureaucrats think about this issue. And it is a great question from the gentleman saying, these are global solutions. You're exactly right. This is the problem. The EU makes you turn and adjusting, European, Germany, you've taken this many, Spain, you've got to take this many. The solution to this problem is the European Union and the developed world putting much more money into countries in the Middle East like Lebanon, Turkey and Jordan, who are actually suffering with this problem. It's cooperating with them and helping them deal with it at the source. That's the problem.
Okay.
There is much more international cooperation if you leave the European Union.
Moving to the last 10 minutes of the debate, so I want to ask people from the floor to keep their questions really short. As a lady, I can't see if there's a man or a woman at the back, but a person with their hand up. Yeah, that's it. And can I also ask the panellists to keep their answers really short so we can get through as much as we can? Yes, please.
Being in the EU, UK is subject to a legal framework which involves an extensive and complex series of laws. These rules make us subject to regulations around free movement of people, free movement of goods and free movement of trade. Is there a consensus among those supporting exit from the EU about how we move away from the plethora of legislation we have already and whether they or not they'd have to create their own laws in response? Do you think that's a major flaw in their argument about the vagueness in their strategy post-exit, if that's the case?
There's no vagueness. So Britain would not be in the European single market if we left the EU. So there's no vagueness. Regulations we would scrap on day one. Net neutrality directive, the European clinical trials directive, the precautionary principle and the new intellectual property laws which brilliantly are trying to make hyperlinks come subject to international property legislation. That would all help our tech industry. The other thing we would stop paying a penny on day one is the common agricultural policy. The common agricultural policy, which impacts massive tariffs on African farmers so French rich farmers can benefit, is the most morally wrong, cowardly policy in the history, I think, of international politics in the last 50 years. The fact the EU has not changed and reformed the common agricultural policy, despite the outcry from Africa and everyone who cares about that continent, tells you everything you need to know about this Eurocentric, politicians know best, rich country club, which has got no interest in developing a truly open world.
Beatrice, the question was, in a sense, was again addressed to the Leave, but from the Remain point of view, perhaps just responding to what Jamie said about some of the things that we scrapped. What's your reaction from the Remain side to those arguments?
Can I just answer the question? Just from one point of view, from the European Union's laws point of view, would there be 2 years to renegotiate all the treaties? And Sir Gus O'Donnell, who presumably the Vice-Chancellor knows very well, said that from his experience of such negotiations, it would probably take at least 10 years. And then there would be a limbo of 8 years. Yes, the European Union can extend that period, but that would be a very long period of uncertainty for you.
You don't have to have Article 50 straight away. It doesn't have to go.
Okay, thank you very much, panelists. We'll take another question from the floor, and again, please keep them as precise as you can, please. I'm going to go for you and the glasses, the spectacles, and yeah.
Irrespective of how you view the European Union itself, whether we leave or whether we don't, there are problems presently that we can't deny. There's Turkey threatening to let in thousands of refugees to flood Europe if we don't help them in the ways they see fit. There's the threat of ISIS, there's the threat of these numerous related issues, intelligence sharing. How will your vision of Britain post-referendum, whatever the result, how will we be able to cope with these issues?
Well, I'll be honest with you, I was having difficulty hearing that question. I kind of think what was the gist of it, but
David, I think the question was that there's a number of threats, migration into Turkey, threat of ISIS, and I think the question was asking, wherever you stand, remain or leave, how would you deal with those kinds of threats that the world faces?
But it's not just a matter of Britain coming out of the European Union and let the poor old Germans sort everything out. It's a matter of changing all of Europe and doing away with the regime that's causing a lot of these problems. So when it comes to the great numbers that are seeking to come in from Turkey, I don't think, and it's why I'm reluctant to go too deep into answering this question, you can't really answer that responsibly without really looking in detail about what's happening in Syria and how, if current initiatives do work and peace is brought, how do you repopulate Syria? Because you can't have stability without a population. So it may sound very evasive, but there are certain things, as I think you said, that even those of us who are fanatical leave people we won't say that, oh, if we just leave the European Union, this will be a magic one that will cure all those things. Also leaving the European Union does not mean that we won't have a thorough relationship and interaction with our allies and neighbours. It doesn't mean that we're no longer friends, or we won't pass on intelligence to the Americans, or we won't buy BMWs anymore, or any of that nonsense. There'll still be a solid relationship and alliance and friendship with those countries to tackle.
Just to quickly answer, would Beatrice want to quickly come in?
Very briefly, Jimmy and Dave were saying that Greece is a faraway country about which we know little. And let them have their problems, we're drawing up the drawbridge.
That's not what's been said at all. I mean, you at least listen to David before you invite him.
Each for themselves.
I know I've got an answer.
Okay, let's move on, because we're again pretty short of time now near then. The lady with the glasses and about 4 or 5 rows to the back, can you keep your hand up please, so that we can get a microphone. You put your hand up high, put your hand up so you can be seen. Down here.
One of the main arguments for the Leave campaign is that the EU is really undemocratic. I want to know, all of a sudden leaving, why does that suddenly make the UK more democratic? If anything, surely we should be looking at our own system, which I think is quite undemocratic, and that because we have quite a lot of unelected people, like special advisors, who have quite a big say on how to make laws. Now, I don't understand why it's more democratic to leave than it to stay.
I won't take the very pointed remark about Jamie starting the chat, if you like to kick off, but we'll let Jamie comment on it as well.
Well, very briefly, I think that the EU does have, it is a democratic institution. It has a parliament, it has institutions that are run by, through the member states, such as the Council of Ministers. It reflects the views of the member states, and it gets a very hard time, quite unfairly. All international institutions are somewhat imperfect. We're not saying that every aspect of the EU or every aspect of any other international institution is perfect, but what we're saying is that they're organisations that we've joined, we get a huge amount out of them. Like any club, you get more out of them than you put in. You get as much out of them as you put in, and it would be foolish to take ourselves out of one of the main institutions that we're a member of, particularly when it gives us access to a market of 500 million people, which we would suddenly be out of. And interestingly, a number of the points made by our two colleagues at the end of the platform show that in the scenario where we did wake up on the 24th of June and were outside, their colleagues haven't really thought that through, either in terms of the process, getting out, the negotiation. It's meant to last 2 years. Gus O'Donnell, who Beatrice referred to as the former head of British Civil Service, estimates it would take 10 years of negotiation because of the complexity, British nationals living abroad, British industries, various other interests. That hasn't really been thought through, and I think that's a shame, and we've seen tonight that actually they're in quite a weak position to reassure you about those sort of bigger foreign policy issues. They're very good at painting a picture, but they're not very good at going into the detail.
Okay, very quick comment from you. Would the post-exit UK be more democratic? Jamie, Jamie answer that. No mind, thank you.
I'll answer very simply. I lost my job as a special advisor because Michael Gove lost his job as Secretary of State for Education. Bad for me, brilliant for the system. Michael Gove had become unpopular with the education system, so voters put pressure on the Prime Minister and he moved it. That's how the system should work. The EU is run by an unelected commission, the EU Commission. Nobody voted for anybody on that, and it is governed by the ECJ, the European Court of Justice. No one voted for any of the judges on that either. The reason it gets better is because everything comes back within this country. You might disagree with David Cameron or Boris Johnson or Michael Gove or Jeremy Corbyn, but crucially you can vote them out and they are accountable to you. The EU is not accountable to anybody, and that's why it does things like subsidise tobacco or regulate biotech that could save Africa's farmers out of existence, because it doesn't have to answer to you. Politicians have to answer to you. I know because it made me lose my job, and that is a brilliant thing. That's how the system should work, because it stops politicians getting out of touch and unaccountable, which is exactly the problem with the European Union.
Thank you, Jamie. Take two more questions from the audience. Please keep them as quick as you can. I'm going to go to the lady in the front row.
Can you just put your hand up, man, and we'll get a microphone to you. Or just bring the microphone, please.
As one of those middle-aged people, most of us have children the age of the majority of people in this room, so we consider ourselves very concerned. I'm a little bit worried about the presumption. Can you hear it? A little bit worried about the presumption, and you did mention the word immorality. I understand your idea that with Brexit, UK would have possibilities of approaching India, China, Ethiopia, etc. But I also know that you can have no guarantee, you have no one from those countries that has publicly come forward and rubbed their hands and said, oh, if you're out of there, we can do this, this, that. You're offering a dream, and I understand why you're doing it, but it's not that kind of thing.
I'm really conscious of the time. I think the question is, you're offering a dream. I think you're directing that comment to the Leave campaigners. David, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I don't.
Well, then what makes me know that you may sign a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. To this young lady, you have got to come and join the Bruges group, because a democratic revival is what this is all about. The European Union is changing. It's not as if it's a static thing where you can assume a certain safety and a certain safety from change. It's changing anyway, so they have to justify their dream. And one of the things I think about this campaign is that if you went back 20 years, the people in favour of the European Union had a dream. They had a beautiful idea, the European idea. Now all we hear from them is fear and threats. I don't think we're anything to be ashamed of, that we have a dream of a beautiful future.
Okay, David, so the points we put, Matt, it's not a beautiful dream, it's fear and threats. How do you respond both to that and to the question from the front row?
I think that the woman in the front row has got it absolutely right. Jamie's an articulate speaker, he's very well informed and well educated, but fundamentally he's peddling something which doesn't exist and won't ever exist. And I think that the challenge really is to see through that and to look at this and weigh up the evidence very clearly. And as I said earlier, on the one hand you've got Michael Gove writing a beautifully written essay, on the other hand you've got real evidence from universities, from people who've worked in the economy, from business people, from trade unions, that matter, for those of you who are left with disposition, and many other voices as well. And I think really we just need to weigh that evidence up very clearly. And for me, as somebody who's not an entirely, I don't think the European Union is a perfect institution, but for me, I think that shows quite clearly we're better off staying in.
Thank you, Matt. I'm going to take one final question from the audience. I'm going to go to the gentleman in blue, please. You've had your hand up for quite a while.
Hi there, this question is to Matt. You mentioned common sense earlier and why we should stay in the EU. So why do you think your party leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has changed his tune on the EU after being highly Eurosceptic for 30 years to all of a sudden being pro-EU? Doesn't sound like common sense to me.
Can I just repeat the question, just in case people at the back didn't hear? The question, I think, was directed first at Matt. Why did his party's leader be anti-EU and then recently changed his opinion? Matt.
Thank you. I think it's very clear, actually. He's changed his views because he thinks that the EU will help protect workers' rights, and that's one of his top priorities. So whilst he realises it's not a perfect institution, he thinks it's far better than leaving. And as he said last week, leaving the EU, and this is obviously from his perspective, may not appeal to everybody in the room, would lead to a bonfire of workers' rights. He's thinking of things like the Working Time Directive.
Jeremy Corbyn and I probably don't agree on an awful lot when it comes to politics, but I respect him for one thing. I think he's a genuine person with a passionate desire to change the country and make it a better place. The reason I'm interested in politics is about changing the world for the better. And all you've heard from the other side tonight is what won't work, this won't work, pessimism, fear. Let's have an optimistic vision for the future of this country. When I look around Britain, I do not see something that couldn't do better than a flawed European Union. I see a country that is multicultural, multinational, looking out to the world, and has an incredibly bright future if we just become more democratic, more pro-science and technology, more pro-free trade. These are all things we can do. No one in this audience should vote on June the 23rd about what they're scared about or what they don't think is possible. I can tell you that anything is possible in a democracy if you go out, exercise your right, and then campaign vigorously to improve the country. The only way to do that is to vote to leave, and then all of us on June the 24th wake up with full democratic control of this country, and all of us begin a battle to build a much better world where Britain leads the world in education.
We're just going to go to the final one there. Right, so just going to ask all the panelists to finish up this question, please keep them fairly briefly, we'll go down the line. So what does your side need to do and say to win over the waverers, those who are still on the fence, and to speak politically about your side? So I'll start with David.
Well, I think it's what was in the final few questions about an idea for the future. What we have to overcome is, well, come on, let's be rude to each other, let's enjoy it. What passes for socialists now in the Labour Party? Who doesn't want change, who just wants to look at his friends, Jeremy Hunt and Goldman Sachs, and vote, yes sir, yes sir. If there's one thing that we've got to overcome, it's this fear amongst people, this obedience, this stifling of our humanity really, of this idea that to look around at what's going on in Greece and everything, and say we can do better than that. So if there's one thing that I think we've got to overcome, and when you asked about a democratic revival, this is what we've got to overcome. It's something that's gone wrong with people in the Western world that have stopped imagining that at the end of their lives they're going to leave the world in a slightly better shape than how they found it.
Okay, thank you, David.
Thank you for your words of wisdom about the Labour Party. It's very nice of you. I think to sum up, really, what we've seen tonight, we've had a good discussion. It's been very frank and fair. But really, at the end of the day, what we need to do is just weigh up the evidence. Do we want to be internationalist, outward-facing, taking part in international organisations, working with them, having a growing economy, enjoying the benefits of being part of the EU, as well as being part of NATO, as well as being part of the United Nations, as well as being part of the Commonwealth, which all support each other? Or do we cut ourselves away into a little isolationist world where we look inward? Jamie and David can talk about trading with other countries, emerging countries, but actually there's no evidence that going out would help that. In fact, the evidence is the contrary, because the EU has negotiated a range of trade agreements which we wouldn't be able to get on such good terms with new and emerging countries like China and some of the other bigger economies in the emerging world. And you weigh up the evidence, it's very clear, if you look at it dispassionately. So on the one hand you've got Michael Gove and a few other enthusiasts wanting to have Brexit. On the other hand you've got a large number of better informed people, and I think we ought to go with the better informed side of things.
I think that how does Leave win this referendum? It's we move the debate to one which is about fear and which is about the 1 week after we leave, and we change it to one which is about building a much better world in the future. It is very clear to me that as we have this debate, every debate I go to, the vote swings to Leave. And the reason for that is the Leave side sets up an optimistic, positive vision which looks around this country, sees an unbelievably talented set of people, and looks around the world and sees a remarkable chance for us to build something which is better, fairer, richer, and most importantly of all, helps the poorest and most vulnerable people. Over the 21st century, we've got the most remarkable opportunity in this world to expand trade and expand scientific discoveries, to improve the world and make lasting leaps forward in the lives of the world's poorest and most vulnerable people. If you vote to remain in this referendum, you reduce the opportunity of us doing it. But if you vote to leave, you vote for Britain to be the country that's at the forefront of that, saying let's be more open, let's trade more, let's do more science together, let's come together as a world. That is the opportunity which confronts this country on June the 24th. But it can only happen if we leave the politicians know best, top-down, centralised European Union, and come together from all political parties and guarantee that we'll go out independently as Britain and we'll build something much, much better.
I'm going to say that I'm very sorry that I can't now live up to the flourish of Jamie, and I so wish you were right. And I'm very, very sorry to be the last person speaking, because I have to go back to pessimism, and that is not a rabble-rousing position to take. Think of it the other way around. The word acquis has made it into the English language through the European Union. It's the thing that we have achieved, the thing that we've come to. Quite seriously, look around in the world. Where would you rather live? Which country which other part of the world would you feel as safe in as you do in Europe? Which country in the world would you feel that your children would be as safe in? Where you could have maternity leave, paternity leave, where you could be sick and you would be cared for in the same way. And what I'm absolutely scared of, and I really am, is not just the whole the military side, that we will be losing that. It is a very, very, very high-risk strategy to say you're going to try to put it all up for grabs, go out, do your own risky thing, ally with whoever it is, compete with countries that have absolutely no social security. The Chinese person falls ill, that is it, they have no social security. If you're going to compete with that, and you have nothing else, nobody else, no consortium of other countries that say, yes, we too will invest that, will pay the price of social security, and go it on your own, I'm sorry, but that is something that I would not risk, and I would not risk it for my children either.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ladies and gentlemen, when you sit where Ollie and I have sat tonight, you inevitably disappoint some people in the audience because you can't get all the questions out. However, I hope you agree that our panel most certainly haven't disappointed us, so please show your appreciation. I began my remarks by saying that a university should be a place of lively, vibrant debate, and I think we've had that and some. Thank you to the audience for your participation. Again, thank you to the panel. To remind you, there's more information about the EU referendum on all channels, as it were, that you'll have a chance, if you want to revisit tonight's debate, to look at that tomorrow. Make sure, if you are a student, or if you're not a student, that you are registered to vote, because whether you're on the leave side or whether you're on the remain side, the most important thing is that you vote. Thank you very much once again to RUSU for hosting us. Good night to you all and happy voting.